Alexander the Great, born 356 BCE, Pella, Macedonia, northwest of Thessaloniki, Greece, died June 13, 323 BCE, Babylon, near Alila, Iraq, king of Macedonia, 336 to 323 BCE, who overthrew the Persian Empire, carried Macedonian arms to India, and laid the foundations for the Hellenistic world of territorial kingdoms. Already in his lifetime the subject of fabulous stories, he later became the hero of a full-scale legend bearing only the sketchiest resemblance to his historical career. Life. He was born in 356 BCE at Pella in Macedonia, the son of Philip II and Olympias, daughter of King Neoptolemus of Epirus. From age 13 to 16, he was taught by Aristotle, who inspired him with an interest in philosophy, medicine, and scientific investigation, but he was later to advance beyond his teacher's narrow precept that non-Greeks should be treated as slaves. Left in charge of Macedonia in 340 during Philip's attack on Byzantium, Alexander defeated the Mede, a Thracian people. 2 years later he commanded the left wing at the Battle of Kyrenia, in which Philip defeated the allied Greek states, and displayed personal courage in breaking the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military corps composed of 150 pairs of lovers. A year later Philip divorced Olympias, and, after a quarrel at a feast held to celebrate his father's new marriage, Alexander and his mother fled to Epirus, and Alexander later went to Illyria. Shortly afterward, father and son were reconciled and Alexander returned, but his position as heir was jeopardized. In 336, however, on Philip's assassination, Alexander, acclaimed by the army, succeeded without opposition. He at once executed the princes of Lyncestis, alleged to be behind Philip's murder, along with all possible rivals and the whole of the faction opposed to him. He then marched south, recovered a wavering Thessaly, and at an assembly of the Greek League of Corinth was appointed generalissimo for the forthcoming invasion of Asia, already planned and initiated by Philip. Returning to Macedonia by way of Delphi, where the Pythian priestess acclaimed him invincible, he advanced into Thrace in spring 335 and, after forcing the Shipka Pass and crushing the Tribali, crossed the Danube to disperse the Geti. Turning west, he then defeated and shattered a coalition of Illyrians who had invaded Macedonia. Meanwhile, a rumor of his death had precipitated a revolt of Theban Democrats. Other Greek states favored Thebes, and the Athenians, urged on by Demosthenes, voted help. In 14 days Alexander marched 240 miles from Pelion, near modern Kos, Albania, in Illyria to Thebes. When the Thebans refused to surrender, he made an entry and razed their city to the ground, sparing only temples and Pindar's house. 6,000 were killed and all survivors sold into slavery. The other Greek states were cowed by this severity, and Alexander could afford to treat Athens leniently. Macedonian garrisons were left in Corinth, Chalcis, and the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes. Beginnings of the Persian expedition. From his accession Alexander had set his mind on the Persian expedition. He had grown up to the idea. Moreover, he needed the wealth of Persia if he was to maintain the army built by Philip and pay off the 500 talents he owed. The exploits of the 10,000 Greek soldiers of fortune and of Agesilaus of Sparta, in successfully campaigning in Persian territory, had revealed the vulnerability of the Persian Empire. With a good cavalry force Alexander could expect to defeat any Persian army. In spring 334 he crossed the Dardanelles, leaving Antipater, who had already faithfully served his father, as his deputy in Europe with over 13,000 men. He himself commanded about 30,000 foot and over 5,000 cavalry, of whom nearly 14,000 were Macedonians, and about 7,000 allies sent by the Greek League. This army was to prove remarkable for its balanced combination of arms. Much work fell on the light-armed Cretan and Macedonian archers, Thracians, and the Agrianian javelin men. But in pitched battle the striking force was the cavalry, and the core of the army, should the issue still remain undecided after the cavalry charge, was the infantry phalanx, 9,000 strong, armed with 13-foot spears and shields, and the 3,000 men of the royal battalions, the Hypaspists. Alexander's second in command was Parmenio, who had secured a foothold in Asia Minor during Philip's lifetime. Many of his family and supporters were entrenched in positions of responsibility. The army was accompanied by surveyors, engineers, architects, scientists, court officials, and historians. From the outset, Alexander seems to have envisaged an unlimited operation. After visiting Ilium, Troy, a romantic gesture inspired by Homer, he confronted his first Persian army, led by 3 satraps, at the Granicus, modern Kokabas, river, near the Sea of Marmara, May/June 334. The Persian plan to tempt Alexander across the river and kill him in the melee almost succeeded, but the Persian line broke, and Alexander's victory was complete. Darius's Greek mercenaries were largely massacred, but 2,000 survivors were sent back to Macedonia in chains. This victory exposed Western Asia Minor to the Macedonians, and most cities hastened to open their gates. The tyrants were expelled and, in contrast to Macedonian policy in Greece, democracies were installed. Alexander thus underlined his Panhellenic policy, already symbolized in the sending of 300 panoplies, sets of armor, taken at the Granicus as an offering dedicated to Athena at Athens by Alexander son of Philip and the Greeks, except the Spartans, from the barbarians who inhabit Asia. This formula, cited by the Greek historian Arrian in his history of Alexander's campaigns, is noteworthy for its omission of any reference to Macedonia. But the cities remained de facto under Alexander, and his appointment of Calah as satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia reflected his claim to succeed the great king of Persia. When Miletus, encouraged by the proximity of the Persian fleet, resisted, Alexander took it by assault, but, refusing a naval battle, he disbanded his own costly navy and announced that he would defeat the Persian fleet on land by occupying the coastal cities. In Caria, Halicarnassus resisted and was stormed, but Ada, the widow and sister of the satrap Idros, adopted Alexander as her son and, after expelling her brother Pixodarus, Alexander restored her to her satrapy. Some parts of Caria held out, however, until 332. Asia Minor and the Battle of Issus. In winter 334 to 333, Alexander conquered western Asia Minor, subduing the hill tribes of Lycia and Pisidia, and in spring 333, he advanced along the coastal road to Perga, passing the cliffs of Mount Climax, thanks to a fortunate change of wind. The fall in the level of the sea was interpreted as a mark of divine favor by Alexander's flatterers, including the historian Callisthenes. At Gordium in Phrygia, tradition records his cutting of the Gordian knot, which could only be loosed by the man who was to rule Asia, but this story may be apocryphal or at least distorted. At this point, Alexander benefited from the sudden death of Memnon, the competent Greek commander of the Persian fleet. From Gordium, he pushed on to Ancyra, modern Ankara, and thence south through Cappadocia and the Cilician Gates, modern Kielek-Bogatsi. A fever held him up for a time in Cilicia. Meanwhile, Darius with his grand army had advanced northward on the eastern side of Mount Amanus. Intelligence on both sides was faulty, and Alexander was already encamped by Myriandrus, near modern Iskenderun, Turkey, when he learned that Darius was astride his line of communications at Issus, north of Alexander's position, autumn 333. Turning, Alexander found Darius drawn up along the Panaris River. In the battle that followed, Alexander won a decisive victory. The struggle turned into a Persian rout and Darius fled, leaving his family in Alexander's hands. The women were treated with chivalrous care. Conquest of the Mediterranean coast and Egypt. From Issus, Alexander marched south into Syria and Phoenicia, his object being to isolate the Persian fleet from its bases and so to destroy it as an effective fighting force. The Phoenician cities Marathus and Aradus came over quietly, and Parmenio was sent ahead to secure Damascus and its rich booty, including Darius's war chest. In reply to a letter from Darius offering peace, Alexander replied arrogantly, recapitulating the historic wrongs of Greece and demanding unconditional surrender to himself as Lord of Asia. After taking Byblos, modern Jubail, and Sidon, Arabic Aid, he met with a Czech at Tyre, where he was refused entry into the island city. He thereupon prepared to use all methods of siegecraft to take it, but the Tyrians resisted, holding out for 7 months. In the meantime, winter 333 to 332, the Persians had counterattacked by land in Asia Minor, where they were defeated by Antigonus, the satrap of Greater Phrygia, and by sea, recapturing a number of cities and islands. While the siege of Tyre was in progress, Darius sent a new offer. He would pay a huge ransom of 10,000 talents for his family, and cede all his lands west of the Euphrates. "I would accept," Parmenio is reported to have said. "Were I Alexander, I too," was the famous retort, "Were I Parmenio." The storming of Tyre in July 332 was Alexander's greatest military achievement. It was attended with great carnage and the sale of the women and children into slavery. Leaving Parmenio in Syria, Alexander advanced south without opposition until he reached Gaza on its high mound. Their bitter resistance halted him for 2 months, and he sustained a serious shoulder wound during a sortie. There is no basis for the tradition that he turned aside to visit Jerusalem. In November 332, he reached Egypt. The people welcomed him as their deliverer, and the Persian satrap Mazax wisely surrendered. At Memphis, Alexander sacrificed to Apis, the Greek term for happy, the sacred Egyptian bull, and was crowned with the traditional double crown of the pharaohs. The native priests were placated and their religion encouraged. He spent the winter organizing Egypt, where he employed Egyptian governors, keeping the army under a separate Macedonian command. He founded the city of Alexandria near the western arm of the Nile on a fine site between the sea and Lake Mareotis, protected by the island of Pharos, and had it laid out by the Rhodian architect Dionycrates. He is also said to have sent an expedition to discover the causes of the flooding of the Nile. From Alexandria he marched along the coast to Paraetonium and from there inland to visit the celebrated oracle of the god Ammon, at Siwa. The difficult journey was later embroidered with flattering legends. On his reaching the oracle in its oasis, the priest gave him the traditional salutation of a pharaoh. As son of Ammon, Alexander consulted the god on the success of his expedition, but revealed the reply to no one. Later the incident was to contribute to the story that he was the son of Zeus and, thus, to his deification. In spring 331, he returned to Tyre, appointed a Macedonian satrap for Syria, and prepared to advance into Mesopotamia. His conquest of Egypt had completed his control of the whole eastern Mediterranean coast. In July 331, Alexander was at Thapsacus on the Euphrates. Instead of taking the direct route down the river to Babylon, he made across northern Mesopotamia toward the Tigris, and Darius, learning of this move from an advance force sent under Mazias to the Euphrates crossing, marched up the Tigris to oppose him. The decisive battle of the war was fought on October 31st, on the plain of Gaugamela between Nineveh and Arbela. Alexander pursued the defeated Persian forces for 35 miles to Arbela, but Darius escaped with his Bactrian cavalry and Greek mercenaries into Media. Alexander now occupied Babylon, city and province. Mazias, who surrendered it, was confirmed as satrap in conjunction with a Macedonian troop commander, and quite exceptionally was granted the right to coin. As in Egypt, the local priesthood was encouraged. Susa, the capital, also surrendered, releasing huge treasures amounting to 50,000 gold talents. Here Alexander established Darius's family in comfort. Crushing the mountain tribe of the Uxans, he now pressed on over the Zagros range into Persia proper and, successfully turning the pass of the Persian gates, held by the satrap Ariobarzanes, he entered Persepolis and Pasargadae. At Persepolis, he ceremonially burned down the palace of Xerxes, as a symbol that the Panhellenic War of Revenge was at an end, for such seems the probable significance of an act that tradition later explained as a drunken frolic inspired by Thais, an Athenian courtesan. In spring 330 Alexander marched north into Media and occupied its capital. The Thessalians and Greek allies were sent home. Henceforward he was waging a purely personal war. As Mazias's appointment indicated, Alexander's views on the empire were changing. He had come to envisage a joint ruling people, consisting of Macedonians and Persians, and this served to augment the misunderstanding that now arose between him and his people. Before continuing his pursuit of Darius, who had retreated into Bactria, he assembled all the Persian treasure and entrusted it to Harpalus, who was to hold it at Ecbatana as chief treasurer. Parmenio was also left behind in Media to control communications. The presence of this older man had perhaps become irksome. In midsummer 330 Alexander set out for the eastern provinces at a high speed via Regi, modern Ray, near Tehran, and the Caspian Gates, where he learned that Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, had deposed Darius. After a skirmish near modern Sharad, the usurper had Darius stabbed and left him to die. Alexander sent his body for burial with due honors in the royal tombs at Persepolis. Campaign eastward to Central Asia. Darius's death left no obstacle to Alexander's claim to be great king, and a Rhodian inscription of this year, 330, calls him Lord of Asia, i.e., of the Persian Empire. Soon afterward, his Asian coins carry the title of king. Crossing the Elburz Mountains to the Caspian, he seized Zadarkarta in Hyrcania and received the submission of a group of satraps and Persian notables, some of whom he confirmed in their offices. In a diversion westward, perhaps to modern Umul, he reduced the Mardi, a mountain people who inhabited the Elburz Mountains. He also accepted the surrender of Darius's Greek mercenaries. His advance eastward was now rapid. In Aria he reduced Satabarzanes, who had offered submission only to revolt, and he founded Alexandria of the Aryans, modern Herat. At Frata in Drangiana, either near modern Nadi Alai in Sistan or farther north at Farah, he at last took steps to destroy Parmenio and his family. Philotas, Parmenio's son, commander of the elite companion cavalry, was implicated in an alleged plot against Alexander's life, condemned by the army, and executed, and a secret message was sent to Cleander, Parmenio's second in command, who obediently assassinated him. This ruthless action excited widespread horror, but strengthened Alexander's position relative to his critics and those whom he regarded as his father's men. All Parmenio's adherents were now eliminated and men close to Alexander promoted. The companion cavalry was reorganized in two sections, each containing 4 squadrons, now known as hipparchies. One group was commanded by Alexander's oldest friend, Hephaestion, the other by Clitus, an older man. From Frata, Alexander pressed on during the winter of 330 to 329 up the valley of the Helmand River, through Arachosia, and over the mountains past the site of modern Kabul into the country of the Parapamicidae, where he founded Alexandria by the Caucasus. Bessus was now in Bactria raising a national revolt in the eastern satrapies, with the usurped title of Great King. Crossing the Hindu Kush northward over the Kawak Pass, 11,650 feet, 3,550 meters, Alexander brought his army, despite food shortages, to Drapsika, sometimes identified with modern Banu, an Arab, probably farther north at Kunduz. Outflanked, Bessus fled beyond the Oxus, modern Amu Darya, and Alexander, marching west to Bactrizariaspa, modern Balkh, Wazirabad, in Afghanistan, appointed loyal satraps in Bactria and Arya. Crossing the Oxus, he sent his general Ptolemy in pursuit of Bessus, who had meanwhile been overthrown by the Sogdian Spitamines. Bessus was captured, flogged, and sent to Bactra, where he was later mutilated after the Persian manner, losing his nose and ears. In due course he was publicly executed at Ecbatana. From Marikanda, modern Samarkand, Alexander advanced by way of Syropolis to the Jaxartes, modern Sardaria, the boundary of the Persian Empire. There he broke the opposition of the Scythian nomads by his use of catapults and, after defeating them in a battle on the north bank of the river, pursued them into the interior. On the site of modern Leninabad, Cogent, on the Jaxartes, he founded a city, Alexandria Esgate, the farthest. Meanwhile, Spitamines had raised all Sogdiana in revolt behind him, bringing in the Masaj-Tai, a people of the Shaka Confederacy. It took Alexander until the autumn of 328 to crush the most determined opponent he encountered in his campaigns. Later in the same year, he attacked Oxyartes and the remaining barons who held out in the hills of Periodicene, modern Tajikistan. Volunteers seized the crag on which Oxyartes had his stronghold, and among the captives was his daughter, Roxana. In reconciliation, Alexander married her, and the rest of his opponents were either won over or crushed. An incident that occurred at Marikanda widened the breach between Alexander and many of his Macedonians. He murdered Clitus, one of his most trusted commanders, in a drunken quarrel, but his excessive display of remorse led the army to pass a decree convicting Clitus posthumously of treason. The event marked a step in Alexander's progress toward Eastern absolutism, and this growing attitude found its outward expression in his use of Persian royal dress. Shortly afterward, at Bactria, he attempted to impose the Persian court ceremonial, involving prostration, proskynesis, on the Greeks and Macedonians too, but to them this custom, habitual for Persians entering the king's presence, implied an act of worship and was intolerable before a human. Even Callisthenes, historian and nephew of Aristotle, whose ostentatious flattery had perhaps encouraged Alexander to see himself in the role of a god, refused to abase himself. Macedonian laughter caused the experiment to founder, and Alexander abandoned it. Shortly afterward, however, Callisthenes was held to be privy to a conspiracy among the royal pages and was executed, or died in prison. Accounts vary. Resentment of this action alienated sympathy from Alexander within the peripatetic school of philosophers, with which Callisthenes had close connections. Invasion of India. In early summer 327, Alexander left Bactria with a reinforced army under a reorganized command. If Plutarch's figure of 120,000 men has any reality, however, it must include all kinds of auxiliary services, together with muleteers, camel drivers, medical corps, peddlers, entertainers, women, and children. The fighting strength perhaps stood at about 35,000. Recrossing the Hindu Kush, probably by Bamiyan and the Gorband Valley, Alexander divided his forces. Half the army with the baggage under Hephaestion and Perdiccas, both cavalry commanders, was sent through the Khyber Pass, while he himself led the rest, together with his siege train, through the hills to the north. His advance through Swat and Gandhara was marked by the storming of the almost impregnable pinnacle of Aurnos, the modern Pirsar, a few miles west of the Indus and north of the Buna River, an impressive feat of siegecraft. In spring 326, crossing the Indus near Attock, Alexander entered Taxila, whose ruler, Taxiles, furnished elephants and troops in return for aid against his rival Porus, who ruled the lands between the Hydaspes, modern Jhelum, and the Acezines, modern Chenab. In June, Alexander fought his last great battle on the left bank of the Hydaspes. He founded two cities there, Alexandria Nicaea, to celebrate his victory, and Bucephala, named after his horse Bucephalus, which died there, and Porus became his ally. How much Alexander knew of India beyond the Hyphasis, probably the modern Bias, is uncertain. There is no conclusive proof that he had heard of the Ganges. But he was anxious to press on farther, and he had advanced to the Hyphasis when his army mutinied, refusing to go farther in the tropical rain. They were weary in body and spirit, and Cenas, one of Alexander's 4 chief marshals, acted as their spokesman. On finding the army adamant, Alexander agreed to turn back. On the Hyphasis, he erected 12 altars to the 12 Olympian gods, and on the Hydaspes he built a fleet of 800 to 1,000 ships. Leaving Porus, he then proceeded down the river and into the Indus, with half his forces on shipboard and half marching in 3 columns down the 2 banks. The fleet was commanded by Nearchus, and Alexander's own captain was Onesicratus. Both later wrote accounts of the campaign. The march was attended with much fighting and heavy, pitiless slaughter. At the storming of one town of Amali near the Hydrotes, Ravi River, Alexander received a severe wound which left him weakened. On reaching Padala, located at the head of the Indus Delta, he built a harbor and docks and explored both arms of the Indus, which probably then ran into the Rann of Kutch. He planned to lead part of his forces back by land, while the rest in perhaps 100 to 150 ships under the command of Nearchus, a Cretan with naval experience, made a voyage of exploration along the Persian Gulf. Local opposition led Nearchus to set sail in September 325, and he was held up for 3 weeks until he could pick up the northeast monsoon in late October. In September, Alexander too set out along the coast through Gidroja, modern Baluchistan, but he was soon compelled by mountainous country to turn inland, thus failing in his project to establish food depots for the fleet. Craterus, a high-ranking officer, already had been sent off with the baggage and siege train, the elephants, and the sick and wounded, together with 3 battalions of the phalanx, by way of the Mullah Pass, Quetta, and Kandahar into the Helmand Valley. From there he was to march through Drangiana to rejoin the main army on the Amanis, modern Minab, river in Carmania. Alexander's march through Georgia proved disastrous. Waterless desert and shortage of food and fuel caused great suffering, and many, especially women and children, perished in a sudden monsoon flood while encamped in a wadi. At length, at the Amanis, he was rejoined by Nearchus and the fleet, which also had suffered losses.